Okay, my name is Dieter Renning. I was born in Germany about half a year after Hitler came to power. To be more specific, I was born in Dresden. My biological mother passed away when I was about half a year old. And my biological father I only knew as my uncle, and he didn't know what to do with me because he just wasn't able to handle a small child. So it was my grandmother on my mother's side, on my later mother's side, who raised me for a year and a half in Dresden. When I was about 3 years old, my adoptive parents came to visit us in Dresden and got to know me and decided that they were going to take me with them and eventually decided to adopt me, and they were from Hamburg. My father was a shipbuilding engineer, and he worked at the biggest shipyard of the city of Hamburg in northwestern Germany. He had to do a lot with Navy vessels, and that was one thing. The other thing is that he just didn't care for the Nazis at all, and every once in a while he would make a negative comment about the Nazis in his office, and his colleagues in the office would say, "Ernst, be careful, don't say that, say those things. That will get you into trouble." And indeed, it did. In 1936, it got him into trouble.
It was later.
It was in 1937. Yeah, it got him into trouble. The Gestapo, the secret police that was created by the Nazis, came to his office and arrested him and interrogated him. And they suspected that he was a foreign agent who was there to cause trouble for the German regime. They let him go, but he lost his job. A certain radius around the city of Hamburg, he was not allowed to work in his profession, which meant in Germany proper he had no job, no chance of finding a job. But after World War I, a part of Germany was separated from Germany proper because it was the way it was where it was located. That part of Germany where it was located, the city of Danzig. Now it's called Gdansk. And is Polish. At that time, it was Danzig, a German city, was separated from Germany proper, and the area where it was located was known as the Polish Corridor, because it was a narrow area to give to Poland, so that they would have access to the Baltic Sea. My father found out that there was a job at a shipyard in Danzig, which was not subject to the same restriction as virtually all the other shipyards in Germany, and he was able to find a job at that shipyard as an engineer. And so we moved in 1937. We moved from Hamburg to Danzig. It was governed by the League of Nations, So it was politically a safe place in that regard. My father found a job, got a good job there, and was very satisfied with the kind of work he had to do. But in 1938, his boss called him into his office and said, "Ernst, you and I think we both know that it's just a matter of time until this city becomes part of Germany again. And then, of course, you'll be without a job. But we have a sister shipyard in farther east, in East Prussia, in the capital of East Prussia, called Königsberg. They are developing that shipyard into a naval shipyard, and they need people with your skills and with your expertise. Would you be willing to commit yourself to work there for a couple of years?" And my father said yes, because that was the only place where he had a chance to get work, to find work. Yeah, it was 1939. We moved to Königsberg.
Which is now called?
A Russian city called Kaliningrad, way up in the northeast. It's a Russian city now, but it used to be in the northeast of Germany. And so we moved there in the fall of 1939 and lived there until January 1945. That's where I experienced virtually all of World War II. It was an interesting life for me as a kid. I started school there, elementary school and high school, before we left there in 1945, in January 1945. And at that point, we had to get out because the Red Army, the Russian army, Soviet army, was just about ready to overrun us. My mother and I were able to leave on a German ship from Königsberg and were able to go to by ship across the Baltic Sea to one place from which we could take a train that took us to my grandmother's house in Dresden, the city where I was born.
Why didn't your father go with you?
He was not able to get away because of his responsible. He had a very responsible position at the shipyard. He was in charge of the submarine section, the U-boat section of the shipyard. So he couldn't get away until the very last moment on a German submarine. He was able to get to the west and end up in his old hometown in Hamburg and spent the last few weeks of the war at a shipyard in Hamburg. My mother and I were able to find a train to take us to Dresden, and 1 week after we arrived in Dresden, Dresden was being bombed. All through the war, it had been attacked a little bit, but not much. There never was anything serious that had happened in the city of Dresden compared to most other German cities. But a week after we got there, there was a massive bombing of Dresden, and this is what this is about. So if you want me to read this, okay. It says here, the sirens started wailing at 9:40 in the evening. It was Tuesday, February 13, 1945. I was 11 and a half then. My mother and I arrived at my grandmother's in Dresden 8 days earlier after an exhausting 10-day trip from our hometown Königsberg, the capital of East Prussia, which we left as the Red Army was rapidly advancing into German territory. We were refugees now, and Dresden seemed a safe place to seek refuge. The city had been bombed a few times in 1944 and early 1945, but it had never been a primary target. Even at this stage of the war, people assumed that Dresden, an architectural and cultural jewel in southeastern Germany, and by no means a center of war industry, would be spared by the Allies. Well, from grandmother's apartment on the 5th floor of the sturdily constructed turn-of-the-century building, an apartment building, we walked, there were no elevators, to the cellar, which early in the war had been converted into an air raid shelter. Some 15 minutes later, we heard the first explosions in the distance. My mother and I knew instantly these were bombs and not the sounds of anti-aircraft guns as we had expected. Back home, we had lived next to a naval shipyard in Königsberg. We had become accustomed to frequent flak barrages, which gave us comfortable sense of security. As we learned later, most flak batteries had been quietly moved from the perimeter of Dresden to the Eastern Front, and the remaining ones apparently were unable to reach the British bombers before they arrived over the city. After the bombing had started, we realized that this was not just another air raid, this was an all-out attack. It lasted a half an hour and was concentrated on the center of the city, where numerous fires broke out, lighting up the night sky, and later developing into a huge firestorm which lasted till the next morning. We were lucky our city district, some 2 miles west of the center, escaped unscathed. The all clear sounded at 11:30, and we went to bed assuming that the bombers had done their night's business and things would be quiet from now on. But shortly after 1 a.m., the sirens again. When the second attack began, we knew that it was meant for us. We could hear the engines of planes approaching, followed by the hissing sound of a mass of bombs falling through the air, and then a rolling wave of explosions which rapidly intensified until it seemed to end with an ear-shattering crash directly overhead. Because of our momentary deafness, we couldn't hear anything else for a while. This pattern repeated itself wave after wave for what seemed an eternity, even though the whole attack, like the first one, lasted barely half an hour. People in the room screamed, whimpered, some cried quietly, some sat frozen with fear, their eyes closed, clenched fists pressed to their temples. I myself had never felt so utterly exposed to forces beyond my control. Not being able to run somewhere to protect myself, to fight back in some way, created a sense of helplessness which was even more terrifying than the frightening noises outside and the seemingly endless shaking of the ground. Early on, Early on, the shaking of the building filled the room with a dense cloud of dust. We soaked our handkerchiefs in a bucket of water and covered our mouths and noses, a safety rule which every civilian had memorized since the wartime bombings began. Some bombs hit close enough to lift us about a foot off our benches. In the morning, we discovered that an old pear tree in the backyard had vanished. It had been replaced by a bomb crater. At some point, the lights went out, causing near panic. When we heard tapping at one end of the room and realized that the people in the cellar next to ours were knocking an opening into the wall, as they came crawling through, we learned that their section of the building had taken a direct hit. After the all clear, we carefully picked our way through the debris on the stairs, past the sandbox and water bucket positioned on each landing to put out incendiary bombs. Apartment doors had been blown open by the bomb blasts nearby. Some had been ripped off their hinges. Our apartment was a mess: plaster, broken dishes, glass all over the floor. Among the debris, we found a delicate Meissen plate, completely undamaged. The pressure from an exploding bomb must have carried it gently from the top shelf of the china cabinet to the kitchen floor. The window panes were all gone. Next to the living room window, we found Grandma's parakeet huddled against the side of its cage, the bottom of it covered with broken glass. Its feathers were darkened by soot, but miraculously, it was alive. At least one consolation for its distraught owner. A box manufacturing plant across the street distributed pieces of cardboard which we tacked to the window frame to keep out the winter cold and the smoke from burning buildings. Late the next morning, I was sent to a store 2 blocks down the street to get some milk. After I heard another customer say that there had been a warning on the radio of more bombers approaching, I ran back with the news. We were in no mood for taking chances and hurried downstairs, alerting the neighbors along the way. The protective steel door to the cellar had just been closed when the first bombs dropped. The city's warning system had obviously been knocked out during the night. The attack lasted only 15 minutes, but before it was over, air raid wardens ordered us out of the cellar, thinking that the building was about to collapse on top of us. Outside, a streetcar had been twisted into an odd shape. There were explosions behind and to the left of us. We hurried past the slaughterhouses to the Elbe River, reading Slaughterhouse 5. Some 30 years later, I discovered that Kurt Vonnegut, the writer, had spent those same fatal hours just 3 blocks away from where we were. A small ferryboat took us, a dozen people at a time, across the river, which is the Elbe River, the same river that ends up near Hamburg. After a seemingly endless march, dodging the flaming debris from burning and collapsing apartment buildings, we reached a city square where open trucks picked us up and took us to one of the suburbs. It was another word. They're not only
Here,
they're not
here not a single bomb.
Here not a single bomb had dropped. Even the sky was almost clear, the smoke from the burning city drifting in another direction. 3 massive air raids in 16 hours were enough to make all of us wish for a speedy end of the war. The outcome did not matter any longer. Still, we were among the lucky ones. We came through it with our skins and sanity intact, while tens of thousands in the inner city perished. For my mother and me, it was on to Hamburg to seek refuge with my other grandmother. There we experienced the tail end of the war. But that's another story. And I wrote this in February 1995. By the time my mother and I arrived in Hamburg, coming from Dresden, my father had already arrived there. He was one of the last people to leave Königsberg, as I said earlier, on a submarine, and he was living with his parents in Hamburg. In other words, with my other grandparents, and we lived with them for several weeks until the end of the war, and then we were able to find an apartment someplace else in the city where we lived for some time, and then we were able to find virtually a house in another part of the city where we lived until I left Hamburg and Germany and came to the United States. But that's another story. Of course, while we were in Hamburg, as long as the war was going on, we ran to a bunker about 1.5 blocks away from where my grandparents had their apartment. Those bunkers, there was no such thing as in Dresden, but they had been built fairly early in the war in Hamburg, and they were really solid. I mean, if you were inside a bunker, it didn't matter what happened outside. You didn't you were not affected by it. So
they're still there, aren't they? The bunkers,
and most of them are still there. Yeah, so almost every night there was an air raid in Hamburg for the rest of the war, and we would jump into our clothes as quickly as we could, run down the stairs and run down the street to the bunker to be safe. So we survived that, and then after the war...
Can you tell about how the British arrived?
Oh, yeah, that's right, yeah. Then there was the reporting on the radio was pretty good during the final weeks of the war. They were for the civilian population to warn them what the situation is and what is going to happen and so on. And we were told at one point that as of the day after tomorrow, we were not supposed to be out in the street. We were supposed to stay inside, and because that's when the British troops would move in and occupy the city.
Which was an open city.
And which was, at that point, had been declared an open city. And, it was a 3-story apartment building where my grandmother, my grandparents had their apartment, and there were several kids in the apartment building, and of course we were bored and wanted to get out to play out in the street and so on. We were not supposed to, but we went down the stairs to the main entrance of the building, looked out through the doors, window at what was going on, and nothing was happening outside. And then at some point we decided, I think there were 3 or 4 boys, including me, we decided, let's open the door and look out.
Didn't you hear something, too?
And we didn't hear anything, no.
Oh, okay.
Then we took one step outside and looked up and down the street, and nothing happening, and then we didn't see anybody. But then in the distance, about 3-4 blocks away, we could hear, ultimately, we could hear the sound of military vehicles moving down that thoroughfare, which were the British moving into the city, into our part of the city. And so we stayed next to the building, but looked around to find out whether we could see anything. And at some point, the building where my grandparents lived was next to a city square, and while we were looking up and down the street, a British jeep was pulling up into the square and parked right in the middle of the square. And there were 2 British soldiers who got out and walked over to a building further down the street from where we were living at that point. And the driver of the jeep stayed with his vehicle, and after he saw us for a while, he decided to chase us away. So he told us to get inside, get inside. Anyway, that's that was our experience with the beginning of the military occupation of the city of Hamburg.
Well, I do have another question then. So how old were you at that time?
I wasn't quite 11.
Oh, I thought you were not quite 12.
I'm sorry, I wasn't quite 12, yeah. I was 11 and a half.
So how did you feel about these invaders that had been blasting Dresden and Hamburg and all the others? How did you feel about them just coming in here? Were there armed citizens that were trying to still kill them, or explain all that?
Well, I think at that point, along with most other people, knew that the war was almost over, and we were hoping that nothing serious was going to happen anymore, and so I was, in a way, I was happy that the British had arrived, because now, with the British here, there won't be any more air raids.
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah.
And this was when, in early May 1945?
Yeah.
So not quite to VE Day yet.
Not quite.
But almost.
No, not quite, but almost. Yeah.
So, are you of Jewish descent?
No, I'm not.
You're not. So that's why your grandfather and father could be employed and everything was cool.
Mhm.
How did you eat during those times when you're just supposed to be sequestered? Like we're experiencing COVID-19's sequestration. And so how do you eat when your city is being bombed? And
Well, at that point in the war, the food was very scarce, and all through the war, of course, food was rationed. So every German had his or her own ration card, and we had to be very careful that we did not waste any food. And at that point, well, we were able to survive.
you had some money, so you bought that food.
We had some money, but the money didn't count very much. It didn't matter very much. It was the ration coupons that were crucial to get your food every day, and so that's how we survived during that time. And then when the war was over, in fact, the British did provide some assistance to the German civilian population as far as food was concerned.
Great.
And we lived for a while. We lived in an apartment across the street from a German school, which had been converted into a military barracks for the British. And we kids there was no school. The school didn't start again till the fall. So there was no school, and we occupied ourselves as well as we could, and we would walk across the street, and there was a big fence, a tall fence surrounding the schoolyard, except for the school buildings, and we would climb up on some chairs or ladders and look over the fence, because we wanted to see what the British troops who were stationed in that school, what they were doing. And one of the most memorable experiences that I had in that regard was at mealtime. The British soldiers would walk from the school building where they were stationed, where they slept and so on, walked over to the to the sports complex, which had been converted into a big dining room. And so we watched them walk over and disappear inside the dining complex. And then when the meal was over, depending on what it was that they had been fed, they would come out and have some extra food that they would give to us, throwing it up.
Well, you said that they told you to go home and get a bowl or
They
something.
told us to go home to get a bowl,
good.
bowl
Or
or
a pot.
a pot, yeah. And so that helped us as far as food was concerned.
Okay, and how about if you explain how your life went until you met Hanna?
As peacetime came, things gradually returned to normal in Germany and in German cities. And in the fall, I went back to school. I finished high school, and excuse me. And
Went to America for the first time.
when I finished high school, I had the chance of taking a free trip on an American freighter to New York.
Wow.
The day after the finals.
Yeah, the day after my high school finals, I took off for America, and so anyway, then after that trip, I started my university studies at the University of Hamburg, and studied there for 2 years. Then I transferred to the city of Freiburg in southern Germany, the University of Freiburg, and studied there for another 2 years. Got my diploma,
In which field?
in economics, diploma meaning at that point in Germany, it was the equivalent of a master's degree. Went back to Germany, went back to Hamburg, and worked for a while as an economist. And then I went back to Freiburg again to start my doctoral studies. And it was while I was working there on my doctoral studies that Hanna came to the United States and
You mean to Germany?
came to Germany and studied at Freiburg. That's where we met, and that's where we got to know each other. And the rest was then my getting my doctorate. And shortly after that, a few days after that, I was on the plane for the United States, and we saw each other again and decided that, yes, indeed, we were ready to get married. And I found a teaching job in Illinois.
This was 1961.
That was in 1961. Found a teaching job in Illinois, and also in 61 we got married, and I've lived in this country ever since.
And you've been loving her ever since.
Yes.
But,
You're supposed to introduce me now.
okay, and now I have to introduce. I want to introduce you to my wife. It's Hanna, born Bonstedt in Germany, and her family emigrated before World War II, and she
And I'll take it from there.
she can take it from there. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to very, very briefly just mention that my parents got to know each other when they were children, and their families had moved from elsewhere in Germany to a city called Elberfeld, not too far from Düsseldorf and Cologne, which was later renamed because it was merged with another town called Baumann, where aspirin was invented, and that was renamed for the river that ran through that valley, Wuppertal, Wuppertal, which means the Wupper Valley, the name of the river. So spent a lot of time at their house, at my mother's house. He didn't have any other siblings, and so that was a good place for him to be. There was trouble almost from the beginning of their teen years because they came from very different backgrounds. My mother's father was the local rabbi, and so she was expected to be a loyal Jew, and her brother, of course, was Jewish too, and they all were very liberal Jews. The father had started off as an Orthodox Jew and then worked his way into getting away from all the rules and regulations to a more appropriate lifestyle if you wanted to be a good German. His wife was from Berlin. He himself was from Hamburg. So Hamburg keeps coming up all the time between us. My father's father was a school teacher, and he actually taught at the school which both my father and his best friend attended. And then his wife, who was a very ambitious lady for her husband, since she couldn't do it for herself, urged him to get his administrative credential, and he became a school principal. And they lived in that area from then on. Unfortunately, my father's mother died very young, but I don't need to go into all that now. My parents, then my father was a soldier in World War I, and so was my mother's brother Hans, his friend. And my father luckily was out of the action until the tail end of the war during the last big German offensive in 1918. And he was immediately taken prisoner. So he was not wounded. He was taken prisoner by the French, who had nothing to eat themselves. And so they turned him and others over to the Americans, who had plenty to eat. And he became the camp interpreter because he'd had 7 years of English by that time in school. My uncle Hans had his nose shot off, which seems very cruel, and then eventually succumbed as a 26-year-old to MS. My mother, in the meantime, was at home going to a women's academy, which was very unusual for a city to have one, which would prepare women to actually become students and earn university degrees. So that's where they were at the end of World War I. And then my mother thought she was going to go into teaching German literature and that kind of thing, but ended up going to a school for social work. So she became a social worker as well as a teacher. And my father spent several years as a student having a very active social life up at the University of Kiel, Kiel, near Denmark, but still in Germany, and finally finished his degree in 1926. So they had to decide at that point whether they were going to marry. They had been engaged for 7 years, and it was unthinkable, really, that the rabbi's oldest daughter would marry a goy. And they decided, yes, they would go through with it anyway. And so in 1926, they were married in Berlin. Both sets of parents attended. And then my brother was born in 1927. My sister was born in 1930, and I'm mentioning them because they were my siblings. I was not an afterthought exactly. My mother had been quite ill with flu in 1930 and had a heart condition, and actually we went to the doctor to see whether she was healthy enough to have another child, because she and my father decided that they were going to prove that a supposed racial disgrace in the eyes of the Nazis, somebody who was part Jewish and part Christian, that was a good thing, and that a child born in those circumstances would be all right. And so I was conceived on purpose under the Nazi regime. I was born 2 months after the Nuremberg racial laws were put into effect. So we were probably going to have trouble. I mean, that was foreseeable. My father was the editor of a weekly newspaper which dealt with political and economic and social matters. And he became editor because the person who had been the editor had to leave immediately when the Nazis took over. She was Jewish, and she went to America. And so my father was having to attend press conferences with Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, and was in constant danger. My mother's brother, younger brother, Albert Norden, was forced to flee as soon as the Nazis took over because he was a communist journalist. And so he hid out in my parents' apartment and other apartments, different place every night in 1933, and was long gone. He had gone to Paris and carried on his work there. Well, now here we were in early 1936. My father had been warned by a stormtrooper who was not totally evil that his name was on a list of people to be picked up. My sister, who was turning 6 in 1936, said in her memoir that my father was shadowed on his way to work every day. Well, I don't know whether that's true, but there was danger. My father thought, what can we do? We have to get out. And so in 1936, he got in touch with a friend of his whom he had met in Berlin the year that the Nazis took over, 1933, a couple of months, well, just 1 month, actually, after they took over. The German Parliament building, the Reichstag, was set on fire by somebody. And of course the Nazis blamed the communists, but probably they set it themselves. My father was standing across the street looking at the fire and got into a conversation with a man who was equally looking at the fire and who was a sociologist, and stayed in touch with this man after the other man had gone to Panama, where they were building up the new University of Panama, which had not existed in any form before that. And my father thought, well, maybe I can work out something with the University of Panama. And so he corresponded part of the time with cables, and we came across the correspondence in regard to his possible employment in Spanish on the internet, just by Googling my father's name, Werner Bonstedt, and then Berlin, and got all of this correspondence from the other professor and from the government officials in Panama. It's all there if anybody wants to read it. And so by March of 1936, and I should say I was born on January 19th that year. By March, my father had an offer of a job at the University of Panama, and we were able, at that point, to take all our belongings with us. Our only restriction was a certain amount of money, and I think it was 20 marks per person, something like that, very minimal. But we were able to take all my parents' books, which are still in our bedroom here in Turlock, in the bookcase that they took with them from Berlin, and various other things, China and other things. We were able to take everything with us. People who left later, like after the Night of Broken Glass in 1938, they couldn't take anything. And they would sew jewelry into their clothing or something like that. That was all that they managed. So by the spring, then we were saying goodbye to our families. My mother's father had retired and had gone back to where his home was in Hamburg. He was a widower at the time. And we went to see him. We have some pictures of that. And we went to see the Bonstedt grandfather, who had married after being widowed for quite a while, a very nice lady. And we said goodbye to my mother's sister, who later, about a year later, left Germany also and went to what is now Israel. So I have a cousin who still lives there, who's 91 years old now. And we had to take the train to go to our ship, which we had secured tickets for, which was going to be leaving from the seaport of Antwerp in Belgium. So we took the train from Berlin, and we knew we had to cross the border. Everybody had a passport except me, because when my mother gave birth to me, it was too dangerous to get papers for a child of mixed race. And so my parents, I don't know how they got the idea, but somehow they got the idea to have an export license for me as a small domestic animal. And since my siblings had nicknames, my brother's name was Wolfgang, so his name was Wolf. My sister was Mouse, and I was Häschen, which means bunny. And so I was going to be a bunny, and I was all wrapped up in blankets on the train in like a shopping net, the knitted kind that you can buy. And they could say, well, that's just a bunny in there. Like my 6-year-old sister, if she spoke out of turn, then if she said, Häschen ist da drin, and Häschen is in there, bunny is in there, it wouldn't be anything too weird because it was what was being exported. So anyway, we got to the border, and the problem was, would the German people let us leave Germany? And so they saw this bundle of things and saw the export license for the bunny. My sister didn't say anything. My brother didn't say much anyway. And so we got past the border into Belgium, went to Antwerp, got on this ship, which was a Swedish or Danish ship, and right now I can't remember which it was, but they were safe there. And we went on the ship for 2 weeks. It took 2 weeks to get to Panama. And my father was continuing to learn Spanish on the way. He didn't know any Spanish to start with. He went to a Berlitz school in Berlin. He was writing out his lecture notes in Spanish because he would have to lecture at the university on economics and other things. And so we settled in Panama for 4 years. And I'm not going to go into great detail because it would take too long. But I thought it was a perfectly wonderful place. You know, I was spoiled, and we went to Costa Rica on vacation, where I was allowed for the first time to leave my playpen because of the danger of hookworm in Panama. And in Costa Rica, we were up in the mountains where there wasn't any hookworm. And so they let me loose, and I had my teddy bear to hold me up. And so I took off, and we have pictures also of me running with the teddy bear through the Costa Rican town of Cartago. My mother didn't do well with the climate there, and so my father started going on lecture trips to the United States in 1938 and 39 during summer vacation. And he was talking about Latin America, economic conditions, talking about the Nazis and the danger that they presented. And this, of course, was during the Depression. So it was almost impossible to find any work in the United States. But there was an organization which helped displaced scholars. And my father was able to hook up with them, and this organization would contact colleges and universities in America to see whether they could hire one of the displaced scholars. And my father was lucky enough to find a position like that at a small liberal arts college in Ohio, Mount Union College. So in 1940, there was a coup in the government in Panama. And the person who had been the founder of the university and had welcomed all of these immigrant professors, because there were several of them, he was overthrown and his brother took over, who didn't like any of these foreigners and claimed that they were all fascists, when of course most of them were refugees from fascism. And we had to leave just in a split second, first ship that we could find. And my father lost his last quarter year's pay in the process. We got on the ship safely. It was a Peruvian ship, so we had to go through the Panama Canal to the Atlantic. Why it would be a Peruvian ship, I don't know. They went through the canal too, I think. But we went via Havana, where we spent a few hours, to New York. In New York, they didn't want to let us land because we didn't have the proper papers. And they would have sent us back to Europe if we couldn't get in. Well, my father luckily had another connection, a man who had been Austrian and had a Welsh wife, and he had left before the Nazis took over and was teaching at Smith College in Massachusetts, and also had a job at the State Department. The immigration people got in touch with him in Washington, and he vouched for my father and said, "This man is not a fascist. He's trustworthy. Let him in." And they let him in. So we landed in Brooklyn in 1940, in the East River Pier, and my parents, I know that this sounds corny, but they actually knelt down and kissed the ground because they were in a free country. And we have been very grateful to be here ever since. In spite of everything that goes on in our country, it's still a wonderful country, and we're proud to be citizens here. So, to make a long story short, my father, after World War II, taught at Michigan State University, and I went to school there too, as my siblings did also. And then I applied for and received a Fulbright fellowship. After I graduated, I went briefly to California for the first time to work in the welfare department in Fresno, and then found out that I had gotten the fellowship and prepared to go to Europe. And this was 1957, 58, the year that I would be there. I applied to go to the University of Munich because I thought that sounded really interesting. I didn't get that. I got Freiburg instead. And so that is where Dieter and I met. We had mutual friends there, and I don't know whether I need to say much more about that except to say that with his background as a refugee in his own country, and with my background coming from a refugee family, we had mutual interests in what that meant to people to be uprooted through no fault of their own, and to try to make a life for themselves, and gave us sympathy for other people in similar circumstances, which has never left us. And I think that we just meshed very well. We talked through lots of things, the things that we've talked about today, and many other things, and we've tried in our life, especially Dieter in his teaching at Cal State Stanislaus, to make a difference for the community, we hope, and do our best to be what we consider to be patriotic Americans. And I'll end it there.
That's wonderful. You were really lucky because of having some Jewish ancestry. Do you have any other family members that went to Auschwitz or Buchenwald, or, you know?
My grandfather, and I will show you a picture of him, the rabbi. This was my grandfather.
Yeah, hold it right there. Let me come in a little closer.
Oh, okay. Whose name was Joseph Norden. And as I said, he had retired to his hometown, which was Hamburg. He had apparently a lovely apartment. We've only seen the outside of the building, which is still there. And then he had to give that up, lost his entire library of 5,000 books, had to move into what was known as a Judenhaus, a Jew home, with other people, and actually was very lucky to have some room to himself, and we've been in that house also. When the congregation was rounded up in Hamburg, even if he had been able, all of his children asked him to come to where they were. Palestine, Panama, China, the youngest. He said, no, I can't leave these people here, because he took over as rabbi for a congregation after he had retired, because the young rabbi had left and gone to England where he would be safe. Mm-hmm. So the entire congregation was rounded up in 1941, I think, or 42. I should have those dates in my head. But they were taken to Terezin, if you've heard of that before. Theresienstadt was the German name for the concentration camp. It was considered to be the model concentration camp, which would show the International Red Cross and everybody else that the Jews were well taken care of by the regime. And they were in what had been a garrison city, just a small city surrounded by walls, and the walls became the ghetto. And he died there of hunger, dysentery caused by hunger. And I won't go into it, I don't think today for the taping, but there's a side story. There are all sorts of side stories about all the people in the family, which would be interesting. But his was that, I think it was when he turned 70, and he recently turned 150, and that's why we have this book, which he had originally published in the 1926, I think it was, which was an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, the Jewish and the Christian understanding of what that meant, and how it was misinterpreted by many Christians and Jews, both, what they understood about the other religious groups' attitude toward that. Anyway, this was just republished and has a section of the hymnal from that congregation where my grandfather was rabbi when my parents were growing up. So this is a little off the beaten track, but one of the people who came to his birthday party in Hamburg was the first Jewish female rabbi anywhere, not just in Germany, but anywhere. And her name was Regina Jonas, and she and her, well, she had her congregation that she took care of in Berlin, and he was in Hamburg, so they corresponded. So we know a little about how things developed between them, because his letters to her survived somehow. Mm. She was taken with her mother to Auschwitz and died there. So, well, first to Terezin too, but I don't think they could see each other there. And then, my mother counted up at some point how many of her relatives died in the Holocaust, and she got to 36 people and stopped counting because she couldn't stand it anymore. Yeah. Like my grandfather had twin brothers, and one of them went, like Anne Frank's family, he went to the Netherlands because they thought that they would be safe there. And they were, I think, probably 5 people in that family were all taken to Auschwitz. And the same was true of several other people. My sister, who was 6 years older than me and is now deceased, she had a real fixation, which is understandable, but it wasn't good for her mental health. She had a fixation on the Holocaust and did some real studies of what had happened to all these people, had their death certificates. I had copies of those. And I don't know what else to say about any of that.
I don't know.
My aunt in Palestine, now in Israel, lost her husband, not in the Holocaust, but when there were 2 bombing raids on Tel Aviv, the big city in Israel, during World War II, and my sister claimed that they were British, but I think they were really Italian. In fact, I think I found that in the internet. And her husband was walking down the street, minding his own business. There were no sirens, nothing to warn them. He was killed. And so their one and only child, who was the same age as my sister, was raised part of the time in a boarding school in Israel, which trained Jews who couldn't be farmers in Europe because they couldn't own land in most of the countries, trained them to be good farmers. And he's 91 years old. He still goes there, he said, once every 2 weeks, I think.
I think so,
In order to look at the correspondence between the founder of that school and Albert Einstein, who was a friend of his. So there are all these weird things. And then my youngest, my mother's youngest sister was born in 1919 after World War I. And she and her husband got out just in time, just before the war started, and went to China because they could get on a ship. He got a job at the British concession in Tianjin, which now has a slightly different name. It's the seaport for Beijing. And so they went there separately, but that's a whole another long story. And so my cousin, who lives in the Bay Area, was born in China. And I think that's enough of that, except for my communist uncle, who became the propaganda minister of East Germany. And that's a whole long story, so I don't think you want to hear that.
All right, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.